Today I wanted to do something that was a little bit more informative. And so I'm going to be showing you guys the 5 main mistakes that I see people making with their productions and 5 solutions on how to fix them. And I didn't want to just use the notepad or just rely on me showing you things because it can be kind of hard to understand these concepts. So I spent a lot of time and a decent amount of money investing into this visual learning format that I think will really help a lot of you guys understand what we're talking about. So the first mistake that I see people making often is being too effects heavy. Normally it's with reverb and delay, but just sort of overall, I feel like people tend to overdo it. And I think the main reason people fall into this mistake by default is that making an effect more exaggerated tends to have more of a satisfying feel. Almost the same way that in graphic design or photography, the more you boost the saturation, the more in the moment it can be satisfying. But then when you take a break from it and come back to it, you're like, oh, that was like way too much. So a way that you can see this problem is almost a balance between the momentary satisfaction of adding the effect and the long-term quality of the track. And I know so many producers who are in this space now where when they are turning up a reverb or something like that, they know to pull it back a bit, even though in the moment it might not be as satisfying to do because they have had that moment so many times in their career where they've turned the knob up too much and it ends up ruining the entire mix. Our solution for this problem as a whole in a macro sense is to just be conscious of how much you are turning up a knob and compensating for that in the back of your head. So instead of turning the decay up on your reverb all the way, maybe just do a portion of the turn that you would normally do. Or another way to look at it is once you have turned up your knob to the point where you're feeling that satisfying feel, then do a course correction pass where you pull it back just a little bit. So that's the macro solution, but I feel like it would also be useful for me to show you guys exactly how I compensate for this with reverb so you can just get an example. So right here, I have a vocal sample that I just pulled from Splice. This is from the Cara pack.
I can show you what love's supposed to feel like.
So right now, I'm just going to show you guys when I hear reverb problems in a track that somebody has sent me, what that sounds like normally.
I can show you what love's supposed to feel like.
All right, like first of all, it's not a bad reverb sound. This is actually one of my favorite reverbs that I use all the time from Native Instruments. It's just that the reverb use in this case is so heavy-handed that it's like almost the only thing that you're hearing. Like it's really drowning out the vocal. So one of the first things I do with the reverb is look for the EQ section where we're going to do a bit of a low cut and a high cut. And the reason that we're doing that is because with a reverb, in the full EQ spectrum we have here, a majority of the frequencies that we want from a reverb are actually here in the mid-range. And these really low frequencies and these really high frequencies can actually kind of get in the way of the clarity of the reverb. So normally EQs will have like a high pass or a low pass built into them, but if for some reason yours doesn't, you can always just add your own EQ.
I can show you what love's supposed to feel like. I can show you what love's supposed to feel like.
And now another thing that I find to be kind of helpful with EQing reverbs is this sort of like low mid-range, specifically with vocals. There tends to be a lot of buildup there. So sometimes I'll do a notch specific to the song and just kind of cut it a bit by a few dB. Sometimes I'll just do sort of a low shelf and just kind of generally cut this off.
I can show you what love's supposed to feel like. I can show you what love's supposed to be.
So already that's sounding a bit more even, not as swimmy. And like I said in that first example, we can actually just take the effect and sort of pull it back a bit. So we're going to lower the decay. And instead of turning the knob up all the way until we get the satisfying feeling, what we've done is we've taken it to where we have that satisfying feeling of a reverb, and then we're slowly bringing it back until we no longer have that feeling.
I can show you what love's supposed to feel like.
All right, so when I bring it down here,
I
that
can show you what love's supposed to be.
it's more of like a room reverb, and that's not really what we're looking for. We're looking for a longer sort of tail reverb. So let's bring it back up a bit.
I can show you what love's supposed to feel like. I can show you what love's supposed to be.
So 2.8 seconds is enough for us to get that long tail that we're looking for. And so we've removed almost half of the reverb time that we had on it previously.
I can show you what love's supposed to feel like.
We can even do a little bit of a high-end notch if we want to.
I can show you what love's supposed to feel like. I can show you what love's supposed to be.
So So again, compared that to what we had at the start.
I can show you what love's supposed to be.
Versus our reverb.
I can show you what love's supposed to be.
If we want to take this even a step further, one of the last problems that we have with our reverb right now, at least that I'm noticing, is that we have a kind of heavily bright vocal. So kind of like here in the sort of 3 to 5K range. And so another thing that we can do to sort of clean up our reverb is prior to our reverb on our send, we're going to add a de-esser that is going to be set to remove that frequency range from the signal that is coming into our send before it actually gets to the reverb, so that now that frequency range that was kind of triggering it a lot is actually not being triggered at all, which can sometimes be better than trying to remove it with EQ after the fact, because now instead of taking an EQ and just kind of cutting that whole part of the EQ out, that part of the reverb sound is still there. It's just more tame because all those frequencies that are annoying are being tamed before it goes into the reverb. So on our send here, let's add a de-esser. We're going to go to sidechain mode, go to bandpass, and we're just going to listen for where the annoying part of the reverb is. So I feel like this 3, almost 4K range is where we're hitting.
I can show you what love's supposed to be.
So now we're just going to bring it down.
I can show you what love's supposed to be.
If you hear that sort of spiky 3 to 4K range,
I can show you what love's supposed to be.
it's a lot smoother now. If we take that de-esser off,
I can show you what love's supposed to be.
turn it on,
I can show you what love's supposed to be.
it's not completely missing from the sound of the reverb. We haven't cut it out with an EQ completely. We're just sort of taming it before it goes into the reverb. And so now finally all together, this is our reverb sound.
I can show you what love's supposed to feel like. I can show you what love's supposed to be.
Compared to what we had prior.
I can show you what love's supposed to feel like. I can show you what love's supposed to be.
Like, it's not even a competition. That first reverb,
I can show you what love.
it still has that sort of long tail feel and it adds that space to the reverb, but it doesn't get in the way of the vocal. It really complements it. So that's how I would go about fixing a reverb like this. Mistake number 2 that I see are vocals that are too heavily tuned. All right, I like tuning vocals. It's actually a decent part of my process, but I see so many people approach it in this sort of like one and done way, and it can kind of ruin a vocal if you're not careful with it. So to show an example of this, I have a vocal from my buddy Ian for a track that we're working on right now. And the vocal here, it's very delicate. It's very moving. It's a very vibey song. And what I will see a lot of people do in the tuning process is they'll pull up just a general automatic tuner where it just kind of quantizes your audio to a note grid.
I remember the first time.
And they'll just kind of dime it with their vocal and hope that it catches something.
I remember the first time.
But as you can hear, it's kind of adding this like T-Pain style vocal, and that is not the vibe of the song that we're working on right now. I don't want to show it to you guys right now because it's still a work in progress, but it's very like acoustic, drivey, singer-songwriter-y. And so this like really heavily tuned vocal, it's not the vibe that we're going for. And before anyone gets mad at me, this is actually not a dig on these sort of automatic tuners. I actually use one in my process. I just think that most people are not using them in a way that is helpful for the vibe of the song that they're doing. So instead of just throwing it into an automatic tuner, and I'm not saying that by the way just because of auto-tune, because auto-tune also has a graph editor, and we're just going to record this into our graph tuner of choice. Mine is Melodyne.
I remember the first time.
All right, so our vocal is tracked in, and so I'm just going to select all the notes, just sort of generally bring them into the range that we want, and I'm going to go through the vocal phrase by phrase and just see if there are any things that I want to touch up. So what I'm doing with these tunings is I'm just sort of making sure that the notes are on the actual note that we're aiming for. I'm using the pitch modulation tool inside of Melodyne.
First
just to sort of tighten up any subtle warbling on some notes, and then the pitch drift tool to sort of fix anything that's sort of going off a bit too much. But as you can see, a lot of the stuff I'm just trying to leave as is. Like with vibrato stuff like this, I actually kind of want to leave it alone as much as I can. And this is the stuff that gets triggered by using an automatic tuner that's just set on a really heavy setting. And it sounds like this.
I remember the first time that I saw you. It was exactly the opposite.
Like, it's very nice, it's very natural, and we've preserved a lot of the tone of the performance. And so now what I'll do as a secondary step is I'll throw on my automatic tuning, but I'll set it to a very low amount just to sort of level it out a tiny bit.
I remember the first time that I saw you. It was exactly the opposite.
All right, so that's what our vocal sounds like now, which is very nice, very pleasant, versus what we started out with.
I remember the first time that I saw you.
It sounds very robotic, and not just because it's tuning it, but because the way that the tuning is approaching the vocal is very much this harsh, like quantize the vocal to the notes. So yeah, for tuning, I would definitely recommend a more gentle approach like this.
I remember the first time.
Mistake number 3 that I see all the time is subpar sound selection. And this one is kind of hard to demonstrate because it's very subjective and relative to the kind of music that you're making. But what I find is people will just tend to grab samples from either splice or synth patches that are in these categories like bass, drums, and not really think about how they relate to the song as a whole. And so the feeling that the song has is that they've just kind of thrown these sounds in. And I think one of the main contributors to this problem is the fact that most of the time people are doing sound selection stuff when they're in the producing phase or even in the songwriting phase. Like at the point of creating the song, you are making all of these decisions, which are very much like technical decisions that need kind of an informed perspective. And you're making all of them when you are in the most subjective, creative part of the process. So my solution to this problem is actually pretty straightforward. What we are going to do is we're going to take all of the decision making involved with these technical parts and we're going to remove them from the creation step. And in its place, we are going to have a separate sound design session. So a point in the week or the month or wherever where you sit down and you sort through what kind of drum samples do I like? What kind of bass tones do I like? What kind of mixing style do I like for my stuff? And you do all of the technical research side in one setting separate from the creation side. And the reason why you do this is because now there is a very hard barrier between these two steps. And when you spend the due diligence to actually get all of your technical aspects in order before you start creating, all of these elements that used to slow your creative process down are actually kind of already determined. You can organize all of your drum samples into folders. You can make presets for your bass tones. You can look through all of the past songs you've made and save the chance for how you like to mix certain parts of your style so that when you get to the creation phase, all of the technical things just kind of fall into place on their own, and you can just go to this one spot, grab your presets, grab your samples, and so you can actually create without worrying about does this drum sample hold up in a mix, because you've already sorted through all of that stuff. So it's actually hidden here behind my camera, but in my folder section of Ableton, I just have all of the plugins for specific uses that I know I need them for, so that in the moment when I'm trying to make a technical decision about how I'm mixing a bass, all of the trying to find plugins and folders is already dealt with. If I need a percussion loop real quick, I know that I have my folder of like specific percussion loops that I like that kind of work every time. And this really speeds up my workflow when I am making something or when I'm producing something, because all of the technical decisions have already been made. I'm just kind of taking those decisions as almost like a Lego block and just sort of sliding it into where it goes. is. Mistake number 4 that I'm constantly running into with people's productions, and in my own, is having too many parts playing at the same time. All right, so I've written a very simple 3-part thing with this almost Super Mario 64 sound. And so here are the 3 parts that I have. I just did this real quickly. Second part. And then the top part. Like, they all sound pretty simple on their own, but when I play them all together, it sounds so busy to the point where like it all kind of blends into one instrument. And if you're trying to go for that sound, that's not bad. But what I notice is a lot of people arranging their stuff like this and not realizing that that's what's happening. The solution for this one is actually going to be pretty simple. We are going to simplify our arrangement so that when one part is doing something high and rhythmic, the other parts are going to sort of counterbalance it. So right here, we have our low guy, which is the chords. And so they're playing something right now that feels very energetic. So why don't we just simplify it to be one chord at the beginning of every bar? So it's just this snip. Now it sounds really boring by itself. When we play it with the rest of them, you can already hear there's a lot more space for everything else. So let's just take that with the second guy here. I think this main one is what we want to keep as is as much as possible. So let's take this next guy. So it's got this sort of like, dun, 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 dun. So why don't we try doing something that's like upbeat? So now this is what we have for that new guy. And so when we play them all together now, and then one last thing is, I still feel like these two are kind of clashing a bit. So one thing we can do is move this into a newer range. So let's try moving it an octave up. Like, everything feels like it's working together now. So let's just really quickly compare it to what we had before. Versus. To me, this one feels a lot cleaner. It doesn't feel like everything is as cluttered as much. And some people might like this rhythm in this lower part here, this sort of like dun, 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 which is totally fine. I would say that if you're going to do that, then you need to really simplify these upper two ones. So you're sort of deciding which one you want to keep as sort of like the musical focus of the part, and then simplifying all the other parts around it so that they play well together. It can also help to think of things in ranges. So highs, mids, lows. And so when you're struggling to really make something simple, you can think about, where is the complexity coming from? Is it coming from rhythmically, how these two are clashing together? So overall, I feel like most people would benefit from simplifying their parts. And then mistake number 5, that is probably the hardest to course correct for and the hardest for me to show, but it's when you are producing something and just the song isn't solid. And what I mean by that is the song itself foundationally, from its chords, from its melody, from its structure. Like, if I were to play it on an acoustic guitar, it doesn't feel like it's all there. And I've run into so many tracks where the producer has very clearly put a lot of work into the track. Like, it's obvious. But the downfall is that if I were to take the song and just put it on an acoustic guitar and sing the melody, it's not there. Like, it doesn't feel like a song in that context. And when I'm talking about that, I'm not even talking about all songs need to be like singer-songwriter. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is from its bare bones stripped down part to just the bare bones rhythms, chords, melody of the track. Are those dialed in? Because the way that you can see this is, this box is your song. This is your foundation. And the foundation is going to be made up of things like like your chord progressions, your melodies, the rhythms that are just kind of intrinsically in your song, either as individual parts or the way that parts are interacting with each other, or just like the overall vibe of the track. Like if you take something down to its bare essentials, most of the time, the vibe of the track can still be there. The reason why it's so important for you to have all of this stuff as solid as possible, because anything you do to produce it is going to be built on top of it here. So if there are like a bunch of cracks in the foundation of your song and you build production on top of it, it almost has this feeling of like the production is about to fall over at any second. Like whatever synths you build are going to be reliant on this fundamentally broken chord progression. Any kind of drums or percussion elements that you add are going to be based off of rhythms that aren't there yet. And your vocals are going to be singing melodies and lyrics that just kind of don't feel right. And so it doesn't really matter how you mix them. And the reason why I'm using examples like acoustic guitar is because a lot of genres that use sort of minimalist elements tend to have a better repertoire of getting this foundation as solid as possible, because they really don't have a lot of elements to add on top of it. For singer-songwriter stuff, it's just an acoustic on top of it. But because everything is so well laid out here, the chord progression is a solid, simple chord progression. The melody is something very singable, and there's a very clear idea of like a log cabin in the woods. This kind of fulfills a bunch of things that this guy doesn't, even though there's more production elements going on. So my solution to you, if you are struggling with a track where it feels like things are wavering over one another, I would like you to spend some time focusing on this foundational part of it and think, is there something here that is foundationally not right yet? And then go into sort of a minimalist writing point where you just focus on that element. Again, this is kind of one of the harder ones for me to show you. A lot of the things that are going to help you with developing that sense of whether or not these elements are in line is just going to be through practice, repetition, and making as many songs as possible, so that when you are writing the initial chord progression, you have a sort of sixth sense that's like, yep, this chord progression will work. You'll be able to use things like Pinterest or your own imagination to just be like, okay, I've got a vibe for this. Let's go towards that, so that when you're developing the rest of your production elements, there's something really solid that is guiding those decisions. So hopefully you guys found this helpful. Let me know if you would want more videos like this that are a bit more educational. And if so, what other topics would you like me to cover? I do one of these videos every Friday, so if you enjoy stuff like this, hit the subscribe button. But yeah, next week we will go back to our regular track recreations. Yeah, I will see you guys next week. See ya.